Coming up, last week the latest summit of European leaders shaped the future of Britain. Yet Rishi Sunak was absent despite being a leader of a major sovereign European nation. This is the reality of Britain's new life outside the European Union. Heads of the major economies and governments of continental Europe gather in Brussels to decide on things that affect Britain and its entire population, yet the only representation we now have at those crucial meetings is an empty chair. We are now voiceless as the UK's trade deficit with the EU hits new record levels, and Europe formulates a strategy to overcome Joe Biden's unilateral USA protectionism. It doesn't factor in the needs and interests of the UK. Britain has now actually become the rule takers that previously the Brexitists had only dishonestly made us out to be. Stay tuned. If you enjoy watching the Truth to Power channel, I'd really appreciate it if you'd help me out by hitting the like button and especially by sharing a link to this video on your social media platforms. Government Minister Mel Stride has now admitted that Brexit has harmed investment in the UK by creating new barriers to doing business. Asked if Brexit had hit business investment, Mr. Stride told the BBC, "I think if you have a situation where you create frictions between yourself and your major trading partners, I think you have to accept that that will have an impact." Well, the determination of the Tory cabinet not to blink on Brexit has finally cracked, as pressure to acknowledge the elephant in the phone box builds with every set of economic indicators released by the government. The most recent incarnation was the UK's trade deficit with the European Union, which widened to a record level in the final quarter of last year. The balance of trade deficit in goods rocketed to £32.9 billion, which is actually the largest gap since records began. Imports from the EU hit a record high of £82 billion, while exports decreased by 2.3% in the last quarter alone, reflecting the customs barriers now in place post-Brexit. And still, the Brexitists lurking in Idiot's Corner are leaving comments on this channel blaming the crumbling British economy on COVID and the war in Ukraine, when if anything, continental Europe was hit harder by both these factors. In reality, it's a combination of Brexit and Tory cuts and mismanagement that have bollocksed the UK economy ever since 2010. We are still the only member of the G7 with an economy smaller than it was before the pandemic. No wonder that this kind of pressure from the facts has led Work and Pensions Minister Mel Stride to crack. I'm sure other cabinet ministers will soon follow, even as Jacob Rees-Mogg and his cohort of swivel-eyed hard Brexitists inserts their appendages in the dike. Every new poll reconfirms that the public are overwhelmingly now seeing through the lies and hidden agenda of the Brexit that they were sold. The dike has been breached. The truth is flooding in. And when the Idiot's Corner mob try to say that Brexit has led to larger pay increases for workers in the new sunlit uplands of post-Brexit Britain, in the real world of double-digit inflation, Brexit has exacerbated the cost of living crisis, with pay increases lower than inflation in all sectors of the economy. After inflation, those so-called pay increases are Brexit benefit unicorns, real terms pay cuts caused by the Brexit. Just last week, Bank of England policymaker Catherine Mann said Brexit was adding to the cost of living crisis in the UK and made the country unique in its bid to tackle inflation, saying, "No other country chose to unilaterally impose trade barriers on its closest trading partners." And yes, that is a Bank of England policymaker speaking there, not some lefty woke political commentator. The balance of total goods and services trade with the whole world also slipped to a record low of minus £11.4 billion in December, according to the ONS. With the pound having lost a fifth of its value post-Brexit, you'd expect to see exports soar and imports fall. But as Michael Saunders, a former Bank of England official, says, The UK chose Brexit in a referendum, but the government then chose a particularly hard form of Brexit, which maximised the economic cost. Any hope for economic upside from Brexit is pretty much gone. And L. Alan Winters, co-director of the Centre for Inclusive Trade Policy at the University of Sussex, chips in with, "The most plausible reason as to why Britain is doing comparatively worse than comparable countries is Brexit. Yet still, our political leaders fail to acknowledge the elephant in the room. And hence that summit of European leaders I mentioned in the introduction, which went ahead without any British presence, consultation or input. Brexit has brought about the very situation that the Brexitists claimed existed before Brexit, but in reality has only come about after Brexit. The Brexitists claim for decades that Europe was something being done to Britain by foreigners, when all along it was something that Britain negotiated for itself in partnership with its neighbours. It's only now that Brussels has become the very thing its paranoid, xenophobic Brexitist opponents imagined. A powerhouse of policies that Britain has no say in, yet which affects it on an existential level. Brexit has become a self-fulfilling prophecy. So, what did the UK miss out on not being a part of this summit? Well, the agenda specified, and bear with me here, those at the back, it sounds a bit dry on first hearing. In face of the new geopolitical reality, EU leaders will discuss long-term competitiveness and how to harness the full potential of the single market. What that actually meant in practice was a lively debate about the EU's reaction to American measures designed to corner the market in low-carbon technology. The European Union leaders discussed their response to Joe Biden's Inflation Reduction Act, which sets out gargantuan American government subsidies for solar and wind technologies made in America, leading to the kind of protectionism for American producers that Biden's orange predecessor could have only dreamt of, and leaving all other nations in the world effectively locked out from the lucrative US market, while also having to protect their own suppliers from a potential influx of cheap, subsidised American solar panels and wind farm components. Biden is trying to do his best for the USA in the face of three unfolding world crises: the new Cold War with China, the aggressive rogue state of Russia, plus the ever-worsening climate crisis. The UK and Europe also face these problems, plus this new USA protectionism. And on top of that, Britain alone has to face the self-imposed trade sanctions of a Brexit that also dictates that the country will play no part when the European Council formulates the EU's response to America, leaving us as a nation isolated. Despite the nonsense in Idiot's Corner about Britain and the EU being Germany's poodle, the reality is that we were Germany's equal partner. Now, isolated from the EU, we may have no option but to become America's poodle, a nation importing green technologies that have been invented and manufactured in China, Europe, and increasingly from the massively government-subsidised America. These are the big players who actually got their act together, and we are now an isolated player, hampered and distracted by the Brexit, with a governing party that has no plan, no energy, and more interest in fighting culture wars and corruptly diverting as much money from the state to their cronies as they can before they get kicked out of power at the next election. The oligarch Prime Minister Rishi Sunak already has too much on his hands fighting the various internal factions in his own Tory party, as well as fighting to avoid scrutiny of his own and his wife's tax affairs and their links with companies operating in or linked to the Russian economy. So as far as the new green industries are concerned, the US, China and Europe are halfway around the world, while Sunak has yet to put his boots on. He leads a factionalised Tory party, stripped of all the sensible Tories by Boris Johnson's insistence on all the 2019 parliamentary intake swearing allegiance to his loony hard Brexit deal, guaranteeing a UKIP government in all but name. This is a hard right government which is dead set against state interference in the economy on the scale required to ensure Britain's place at the forefront of the new green technology sectors. We have a government whose dogmatic free market philosophy dictates that the best thing the state can do for an enterprise is to get out of its way. A government petrified by its own minority libertarian wing, the anti-European ERG European Research Group, allied with Dim Lizzie Truss's Conservative Growth Group. Together, they form a cult-like entity that prevents Sunak from considering the sort of policies that Labour are now advocating, of state investment in green energy, green enterprises, and a new publicly owned energy company. The supposed benefit of the Brexit was British sovereignty, the ability to act quickly to make our own rules. But even if that were the case, Sunak's precarious political position means he wouldn't be able to make use of any of this so-called agility to take Britain to the forefront of these new industries anyway. Britain is an isolated economy whose credibility has been shot to pieces by Boris Johnson clowning on the international stage, followed by a bonkers Brexit, and made even worse by the economic madness of Trussonomics. In another 2 years, we can hope for a Labour government that has some strategic foresight. But by then, China, the USA and the EU will be even more dominant economically. And anyone investing in Britain will want to be able to sell to those three major economic powers, particularly the one on our very own doorstep. And that means that in post-Brexit Britain, much as it was in pre-Brexit Britain, sovereign rules can of course be implemented by Parliament to give British companies a head start. But those rules will end up being aligned with whatever Brussels does, in order to allow barrier-free trade with the large trading bloc on our doorstep. Any sovereignty that the Brexit gave Britain was purely rhetorical and theoretical. Every post-Brexit trade deal has literally traded sovereignty for easier trade arrangements with a series of countries. But post-Brexit Britain has fundamentally changed from being a rule maker within the EU, and don't forget 97% of EU law was either proposed or supported by the UK, to being a rule taker. A Britain fictitiously being dictated to by Brussels was the big lie put forward by the Brexitists as the primary reason to leave the EU. But it's only since the Brexit that voiceless Britain has indeed had to follow EU rules without having any say whatsoever in their formation.
Welcome to the Brexit, sir. I'm sorry.
Oh my God.